There's a certain romance to the way Britain used to eat when times were hard. Not the glossy photographed plates we see today, but food born out of cold kitchens, worn-out pay packets, and a determination that no one would leave the table hungry. In the long shadow of the Great Depression, British families didn't just survive, they improvised. They took the cheapest vegetables, the last scrap of meat, the day-old bread, and turned them into meals that could warm you right through to your bones. These weren't fancy dinners. No one talked about plating or presentation, but they were clever, astonishingly clever, and many of them, if you made them today, would cost less than a tenner to feed a family of 6. Tonight on British History, we're stepping back into those kitchens, kettles rattling on the hob, coal fires glowing low, and a big pot bubbling away on the back ring for hours on end. These are 15 Depression-era British meals that were born out of necessity, and yet remain some of the most comforting, satisfying dishes this country has ever known. And instead of counting them down in price order or prestige, we're going to travel through them the way a working week once felt. From the bare-bones basics, up through the clever leftovers, and finally, to the dishes that felt like a feast when money was tight. Number 15. Vegetable stew with bread. When meat was a luxury, we begin at the very bottom of the budget, on the nights when there was no meat at all. The butcher's queue had been long, the wages were thin, and even a few ounces of mince felt out of reach. On those evenings, British families turned to a kind of quiet genius. The all-vegetable stew with a big hunk of bread doing half the heavy lifting. The foundation was always the same: potatoes. Cheap, filling, and dependable. They bulked out the pot, thickened the broth, and made sure no one left the table with an empty stomach. Into the pot would go onions first, cooked slowly in a little dripping or saved fat until they softened and turned sweet. Then carrots for colour and natural sugar. Perhaps turnips, swedes or parsnips, whatever was available at the market, or lurking in the pantry at the end of the week. Nothing was wasted. Peelings and trimmings might have been saved up in a little bowl through the week, boiled up to make a simple vegetable stock. That humble stock became the backbone of the stew. Nothing fancy, just water infused with the flavour of everything that would otherwise have gone in the bin. Some families browned the vegetables lightly before adding water, just enough to catch a bit of caramelization on the edges. That tiny, careful step made the final dish taste richer than the ingredients on paper had any right to be. And then came the bread, yesterday's loaf, going a little dry, sold cheaply by the baker. Cubed and stirred in towards the end, it soaked up the hot, savoury liquid and swelled into the kind of dense, comforting mouthful that could keep a labourer on his feet. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fashionable, but a big enamel bowl of vegetable stew and bread, steaming on a cold night, could make a cramped terrace kitchen feel like the warmest place in Britain. Number 14. Bubble and Squeak, Monday morning alchemy. If Sunday was the one day you might manage a roast, Monday was Bubble and Squeak day. And that's where the real Depression-era creativity shone. Nothing went to waste. Leftover potatoes, limp cabbage, stray Brussels sprouts, a few lonely carrots, all scraped from the roasting tin and cooling on the plate, were given a second life. On Monday morning, those leftovers were chopped, mixed together, and transformed. Cold mashed potatoes, often stiff and unappealing straight from the dish, were beaten together with the vegetables from Sunday. It didn't matter if the vegetables were overcooked. In fact, the softer they were, the better they'd combine. A heavy frying pan went onto the hob with a generous spoon of dripping or lard, the kind of fat carefully saved from previous roasts and poured into a jar beside the stove. Once it was properly hot, that vegetable and potato mixture was pressed down into the pan like a thick cake. Then came the hardest step of all, doing nothing. To work its magic, Bubble and Squeak needed time. It needed to sit there, quietly sizzling, the edges browning and the interior heating through. The name came from the noises it made. Little bubbles and squeaks as the moisture worked its way out and the crust began to form. Only when the underside had turned golden and crisp would you nudge it, flip sections, and let the other side catch some colour too. The result was a glorious patchwork, crunchy, browned edges hiding a soft, creamy interior. Children who had refused their cabbage on Sunday would wolf it down like this on Monday. The flavour of the roast, the fat, and the vegetables blended into something far more than the sum of its parts. A dish born from leftovers, a plate that cost virtually nothing, and yet a breakfast or supper that felt indulgent in its own humble way. Number 13. Welsh caul and potato and leek soup. Warming a nation? Travel west, to the hills and valleys of Wales, and you find a dish that blurred the line between soup and stew. Caul, or the simpler potato and leek broth that warmed countless Welsh homes. At its heart, it was a celebration of two ingredients Britain has always relied on: the potato and the leek. Potatoes were as cheap as they were filling. Leeks, often grown in back gardens or bought in bundles, were one of the few green vegetables that remained affordable through winter. The technique was surprisingly sophisticated. Waxy potatoes might be kept in chunks to hold their shape, while flourier varieties were encouraged to break down and thicken the broth. Many cooks used both in one pot, understanding texture long before recipe books talked about it. Leeks were washed carefully. No one wanted grit in their dinner. Then sliced and cooked slowly in a little fat until they softened and turned sweet. This stage could take 20 minutes or more, but it was worth it. Rushing meant harsh flavours. Patience meant gentle, mellow warmth. Only then were the potatoes added, along with water or a thin stock. Some families mashed a few potatoes against the side of the pot as it cooked, releasing starch and turning the liquid from watery to velvety without a drop of cream. Sometimes a small scrap of bacon or ham bone would join the pot, sending tendrils of smoky flavour through the broth. On poorer nights, it was just vegetables, but still deeply comforting. The result was simple, yes, but it filled the belly, warmed cold fingers wrapped around the bowl, and carried families through long, damp evenings when coal was too expensive to burn freely. A bowl of caul or potato and leek soup wasn't just food. It was proof that even in hard times, Britain understood how to make a little taste like a lot. Number 11. Suet dumpling stew, turning thin broth into a feast. Sometimes, the pot on the stove was more liquid than substance. A few bones, a handful of vegetables, perhaps a scrape of dripping. Enough to flavour water, yes, but not enough to fill the family. That's where suet dumplings came in. Magical little clouds that could transform a thin broth into a hearty, filling supper. Suet itself was nothing glamorous. Hard, white fat from around a cow's kidneys, it was cheap because most people didn't want it. But for families who knew what they were doing, it was culinary gold. The suet was grated finely and stirred into flour with a pinch of salt and a little baking powder. Cold water was added carefully, just enough to bring everything together into a soft dough. The trick was not to overwork it, handle it too much, and the dumplings would turn dense and heavy instead of light and fluffy. Meanwhile, the pot of stew, however modest, was kept gently simmering. Then came the transformation. Spoonfuls of the suet dough were dropped directly into the bubbling liquid. Slowly, they began to swell, drinking in the flavours around them. As they cooked, the suet melted, enriching the broth, while the flour released starch and thickened it. What had started as a thin, slightly sad soup became something entirely different. A rich, hearty stew dotted with plump dumplings that steamed like little pillows when you broke them open. Children loved fishing for the dumplings, hunting them out with their spoons as if they were buried treasure. A couple of dumplings, a few pieces of carrot or potato, and a ladle of thickened broth was often enough to send a child to bed full and content. All from fat no one else wanted, and flour that cost pennies. Number 10. Scarce from Liverpool. Stretching flavour to its limits. Head back to the streets of Liverpool, and you find a dish that carries the city's identity in its name: scouse. Born from sailors' stew, lobscouse, it became a masterclass in stretching flavours as far as they could go. The trick was ruthless efficiency. A little meat and a lot of potatoes. In many homes, there might be 5 potatoes for every small scrap of meat, sometimes more. But the genius lay not just in the ratio, but in the careful way everything was cooked. First, whatever meat could be afforded, tiny offcuts of beef, lamb, or even leftover roast, went into a heavy pot. It was browned properly, not rushed, until those deeply browned bits stuck to the bottom, carrying more flavour than the meat itself. Then in went the onions, to soften and pick up that browned goodness. Carrots followed, chopped chunky so they'd hold their shape but softened just enough to release sweetness. And finally, the potatoes. Lots of potatoes. Some would gradually dissolve into the liquid, turning it thick and velvety. Others would hold firm, giving you satisfying mouthfuls to chew. Hours later, the result was a stew that tasted intensely meaty, even though most of it was vegetables. Rich, brown, Clinging to the spoon, it fed families who couldn't dream of affording a big cut of roast. And when things were really dire, there was blind scouse. No meat at all, just vegetables, potatoes, stock, and skill. Yet done properly, even that could feel like a proper meal at the end of a long day. Number 9. Lancashire Hotpot, a working day in a dish. From Liverpool, we cross the Pennies to the mills of Lancashire, and to a dish that has become a symbol of northern thrift and comfort, Lancashire Hotpot. In the weaving towns and cotton mills, workers left home in the dark and came back in the dark. 12-hour shifts, lungs full of lint, hands raw from machinery. They needed a meal waiting for them. Something that could sit in the oven all day, quietly transforming. The answer was simple and brilliant. You started with the cheapest lamb you could find, neck, shoulder, or even elderly mutton. Cuts most people turn their noses up at, but that held deep flavour if you treated them with patience. The meat was cut into chunks and layered in a heavy dish with slices of onion, paper thin so they'd melt by the time the dish was done. A small amount of stock or even just water was poured in, not too much, just enough to create steam and start the slow transformation. Then came the potatoes. Not thrown in haphazardly, but sliced all to roughly the same thickness and laid over the top in careful overlapping rows like roof tiles. That top layer wasn't just for decoration, it formed a tight lid that kept the moisture and flavour trapped underneath while the very surface crisped and browned. The dish went into a low oven for hours. While mill workers tended machines and watched the clock, their dinner was quietly turning into something extraordinary at home. By the time the door finally opened and boots were kicked off by the hearth, the hot pot was ready. The lamb, once tough, now fell apart at the touch of a fork. The onions had dissolved into a sweet, savoury layer. The potatoes beneath had soaked up juices and gone almost creamy, while the top layer had turned golden and crisp. One pot, one cheap cut of meat, enough to feed an entire family and make them feel, just for a moment, like they were eating something fit for a king. Number 8. Shepherd's pie and cottage pie, architecture in a baking dish. By the time we reach shepherd's pie and cottage pie, we're in the realm of dishes that still appear on British tables today, often without people realising quite how clever and how frugal they really are. At their heart, they are about turning scraps into something special. The meat was rarely the neat, expensive mince we buy today. Families would ask the butcher to mince offcuts and trimmings, the bits that other customers didn't want. Because those odds and ends came from different parts of the animal, they often had more flavour than the neat, uniform mince in tidy little trays. That mince went into a pan with diced onions, carrots, and whatever vegetables were looking tired at the bottom of the pantry. It was browned slowly, not just cooked until no longer pink, but allowed to catch and colour, building the deep savoury notes that made the final dish feel richer than the shopping list. A spoonful of flour might be stirred through to thicken the juices into a proper gravy, perhaps with a splash of leftover stock, or even just water and seasoning. Then came the centrepiece, the potato topping. Potatoes were boiled until thoroughly tender, then mashed with all the care and attention usually reserved for more glamorous ingredients. A knob of butter if you had it, a splash of milk, perhaps a spoon of fat saved from a roast. The idea was to create something soft and fluffy, but it didn't end there. The real magic lay in what happened when the mash met the meat. It was spread over the top in a generous, thick layer, then worked with a fork to create ridges and peaks, not just for looks, but for function. Those peaks caught the heat of the oven and turned golden, crisping on the tips while remaining soft and creamy underneath. When the dish came out of the oven, it looked like a landscape, browned hills and valleys of potato, hiding a rich, bubbling layer of meat and vegetables beneath. A modest amount of meat, stretched with skill and topped with a crown of potato, could feed a large family. And when you broke through that crust with a spoon, you weren't thinking about how little it cost. You were thinking about how good it tasted. Number 7. Toad in the hole, turning cheap sausages into a spectacle. By the time we reach Toad in the hole, the rhythm of Depression-era cooking becomes unmistakable. Even the humblest ingredients could become a feast with a little understanding, a hot oven, and the sort of patience you only learn by cooking every day for a large family. Sausages back then were not like the neatly packed, meat-heavy versions we buy today. They were cheap, filled with breadcrumbs, water, and whatever offcuts were left at the butcher's counter. They were known for bursting, literally banging, if you cooked them too fast. But in Toad in the Hole, these sausages didn't need to be perfect. They simply needed to be hot. The technique was deliberate. First, you placed the sausages in a heavy iron tin and slid them into a very hot oven until they began to sizzle and spit out their fat. This step was more than browning, it was preparation. You were making a shallow lake of blistering hot fat that the batter depended on. Meanwhile, the batter flour, eggs, milk, and a pinch of salt was whisked until smooth. Yorkshire pudding proportions. Nothing fancy, just whisking until your arm ached slightly. Then came the magic moment. You'd pull the pan from the oven, the fat shimmering and almost smoking, and into that fat you would pour the batter in one confident go, no hesitation. The sound was incredible. A furious hiss as the batter hit the hot fat, the bottom cooking instantly, the sides beginning to climb. Back into the oven it went, and then you waited. Slowly, majestically, the batter would rise around the sausages in great crags and cliffs of golden dough. Some bits would puff tall, others stay tender and pancake-like, every version slightly different, but every household proud of their own. For children, this dish was theatre. For adults, it was sustenance. For everyone, it was proof that even a few humble sausages could turn into a meal that filled both stomach and spirit. Number 2. Liver and onions with bacon, nutrition disguised as a treat. Often overlooked today, liver was once one of the most important nutritional foods you could buy on a small budget. Rich in iron, vitamins, and minerals, it was a powerhouse ingredient, but it needed finesse. Depression-era cooks knew the trick. Soak the liver in milk to pull out strong metallic flavours. Then cook bacon slowly, letting it render. Add onions, cook them until they turn golden. Dust the liver with a little seasoned flour and fry it quickly, never overcook, or it turned tough. With mashed potatoes on the side and bacon crumbled over the top, even children who swore they hated liver would eat every bite. To this day, people who grew up in the era still speak fondly of this dish. Warm, rich, simple, and nourishing in every sense of the word. Number 1. Kedgeree, the coastal trick that fed generations. Finally, we come to kedgeree, a dish often linked with Victorian kitchens, but kept alive during the Depression because it was cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. You started with smoked fish, often undemanding varieties like fin and haddie or whatever the fishmonger had left over. Poached gently to remove salt, then flaked into tender pieces. Rice, cheap, filling and dependable, was cooked separately. Hard-boiled eggs were chopped and stirred through. If you had curry powder, you added it. If you didn't, you seasoned carefully with pepper and herbs. The mixture was gently heated together until the flavours melded. Smoky fish, soft rice, rich eggs. A complete meal for pennies. And to this day, kedgeree remains one of Britain's most quietly brilliant dishes. Simple ingredients, clever cooking, and a flavour that feels far more luxurious than its cost. It's the secret they all knew, and what it means today. Here's the astonishing truth. The average British household today spends £1,500, £2,000 every single month on takeaway meals, convenience foods, and ready-made dinners. Over a year, that's £24,000 more than many people earn. Meanwhile, Depression-era meals built on potatoes, dried peas, leftover vegetables, and cheap cuts of meat could feed an entire family for a fraction of the cost. Recreate these techniques today, and you can save £9,000, £16,000 a year for a family of 4, £2,200, £4,000 a year for a single person, all while eating food that's richer, healthier, and infinitely more satisfying. These meals weren't just recipes, they were wisdom, they were survival, they were the story of a nation that knew how to make the most of what it had. If you've enjoyed this journey into Britain's Depression-era kitchens, I invite you to subscribe to British History for more warm, nostalgic storytelling about the way we lived, worked, cooked, and connected. Let us know in the comments. Did your parents or grandparents cook any of these meals? Which one brought back the strongest memory for you? Thank you for watching, and until next time, may your kettle stay warm, your pantry never feel empty, and your memories always taste this comforting.